We're less than 5 months away from the 2020 presidential election, and before people head to the polls, a new book has some practical advice to help them prepare. It's called What You Need to Know About Voting and Why. It covers the basics, like how to cast your ballot, but also looks at the history of voting, including the impacts of voter suppression and misinformation. Kim Wehle is the author, and she joins me now. Kim is also a CBS News legal analyst. Kim, welcome. It's nice to see you again. Why did you feel a guide like this was needed right now?
Well, one is that we have a real problem of civic literacy in this country. Only 1 in 3 Americans can name all 3 branches of government. And this election is really epic in terms of our voting on the kind of government we want. Regardless of political party, we're seeing the guardrails of democracy fail and the executive branch essentially go forward with very little oversight from Congress and the courts. So it's really important if people want to preserve democracy, Republicans, Democrats, independents, voting is really the only way left to do that itself. And then the third reason is that there's so much polarization amongst Americans, we the people, in favor of we the Democrats or we the Republicans. As an educator, I believe that if we can go back to some fundamentals, some foundational concepts that draw us all together, perhaps we can have these dialogues around common ground. That is, why we're Americans, why the country was established to begin with, and how this really is consent of the government governed. There is no one person that gets the power without the consent of the governed, and the way we do that is at the polls.
So as we approach November, how concerned are you about voter participation, especially in the middle of a pandemic?
Yes, it's very serious for a number of reasons. One is that voter registration was up in January and February and then plummeted in March once the virus hit. And that's because the DMVs, the motor vehicle registration locations across the country were closed. That's a major way people register. Get out the vote drives are not happening because it's not safe to gather in large groups. And of course, we saw in Wisconsin, for example, at least 71 people get COVID by virtue of exercising their constitutional right to vote. So states, all but 5 at this point, have loosened their laws to enable voting by mail with the excuse of COVID. There's some lawsuits pending. We know the president and people on the Republican side of the aisle have argued that that's not a way to vote, but actually 5 states have done it exclusively, including the Republican-leaning Utah. So it can be quite safe, but the issue is people need to register now. The states cannot plan for the party, so to speak, if they don't know how many people are coming. And that happened in Wisconsin. Big voter turnout at the end, and there just wasn't time to order the ballots, to get the ballots to them, to count the ballots in time to actually have everyone's vote count. So the message is register, ask for an application by mail, and do it soon.
So you spell out in the book how it's actually states that really control the way in which these elections proceed. And I wonder what changes more broadly and reforms you would like to see made to our voting system.
Yeah, it's interesting in that we talk about all kinds of constitutional rights, First Amendment rights, Second Amendment rights, and they're pretty consistent across the country. A Supreme Court says this is the right you have, and it's consistent. For voting, it really does depend on your zip code. Where you live will determine how easy it is to register, how easy it is to stay on the rolls, and how easy it is to actually vote on Election Day. That being said, the Congress, under the Constitution, does have power to issue rules across the board. We saw this with the Voting Rights Act. We saw this with the motor voter law that lets us all register at the DMV. I would like to see Congress appropriate a lot more money to the voting system on the theory that without a functioning voting system across the country, we can't have our voices heard on all kinds of other issues that matter to us. Congress hasn't given money to the states for voter equipment, for example, since 2002. How many of us are using our flip phones from 18 years ago? It's really hard for states to pull this off without the funding. And of course, with COVID, state coffers are even more empty than before. I know we have all kinds of technological advances. In 2020, of course, we do a lot of our banking on our phones. That is encrypted. It's done largely in a safe way, both in terms of avoiding fraud and making sure that it's easy for us. Those kinds of technologies technologies, if rolled out across the country, could bring more and more people to the polls to exercise their right to vote in an easy, safe way that avoids fraud. But unlike other countries, other democracies, we are an opt-in system. In other places, you're born, you get an ID card from the government, and you're automatically enrolled. For Americans, you have to put your hat in the ring and say, I want to vote. And some people say it's not the right to vote in America, it's the fight to vote in America. So the message is to people, this is as important as anything else in your life, and it's worth taking the time to get yourself registered.
Kim, as you know, earlier this month, we saw some chaotic primary elections, specifically in Georgia, where problems with equipment and a lack of poll workers caused some people to wait in lines for hours. Some people called it voter suppression. What do you think are some ways to prevent that come November?
Well, voter suppression is real. It goes back to the beginning of our republic, where only white male landowners could actually vote. That tent's been enlarged over the years, but there still are efforts to only allow, quote, the right people to vote, to exercise their right to vote. We will see basic negligence and problems, just normal problems in executing a very complex, multi-layered process. That's going to happen anyway. We saw that in part in Georgia, where there weren't enough machines, the machines broke down. The problem in Georgia, in part, was some of those, the biggest issues were in neighborhoods with communities of color, low-income neighborhoods. That's really a problem if people of higher means have an easier time voting than others. I do think there's a multi-step process here to protect your own right. One, register now to vote by mail. If you don't get your ballot in time, check at your Secretary of State's website for good information to figure out when the hours are for early voting, if your state authorizes that. Barring that, you show up on Election Day with your hand sanitizer, your mask, a granola bar, and plan to stay as long as you need to. And bring a few friends who aren't used to voting. That's the way we can take back our democracy, person by person. If every person of the 50% or so that traditionally vote in American elections that are eligible to vote, if every person brought one more person, we'd be close to 100% if you just do the math, if my math is right. And of course, if you show up in the polls on Election Day and you're told you can't vote for some logistical reason, ask for what's called a provisional ballot. They have to give it to you, and then follow up after to make sure that your vote was counted and your vote mattered. The last piece, of course, is foreign interference. Careful about the messaging you see on social media. Facebook and Twitter are claiming that they're making efforts to not allow Russian bots to spread lies, but be really vigilant, just like you're vigilant with your pocketbook at the grocery store. You lock your house when you leave. You lock your car when you get out of your car to go into the grocery store. This kind of information, it's really criminal activity, so to speak. I mean, I don't know if it's technically or not criminal, but these are not messages that are designed to help Americans exercise their right to vote. So be really vigilant and in terms of the kind of information that you're reading and you're accepting as a basis for how you vote and also whether you vote. It's always best to be heard at the polls.
All right, Kim Wehle, the book is What You Need to Know About Voting and Why. Some really practical advice in there, especially that one, as you mentioned, the provisional ballot. If you show up, there's a problem, ask for your provisional ballot. Kim Wehle, thank you so much. Great to see you.
Thank you, Elaine.